You're listening to the Knowledge Archives podcast. Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines as possible. I'm your host, Eileen Farnood, and today I have the pleasure to be joined by Dr. Mélanie Guigueno, an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at McGill University. Her research group combines field and wet lab work to examine behavior, cognition, and the brain in natural populations, how they are linked, and what influences them, whether it be ecology and evolution or environmental contaminants. Dr. Guigueno's lab primarily focuses on spatial behavior and neurogenesis in several avian systems, but research also includes social behavior and its neurocorrelates in fish. In the past 3 years, Mélanie has received the L'Oreal UNESCO for Women in Science Award, the Alice Wilson Award from the Royal Society of Canada, and the Early Career Researcher Award from the Society of Canadian Ornithologists. Her research has been featured in BBC Earth Online, National Geographic Online, and the Globe and Mail. Thanks so much for joining me today. Just to get started with the first question, could you give a brief introduction of yourself and explain some of your current research interests?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I'm Dr. Mélanie Guigueno. I am currently a professor at McGill University. My research interests are all related to behavior, so how animals behave in the wild, and how that relates to cognition, so how they think, and how that relates to the brain. And my lab is focusing primarily on neurogenesis, so the production of new neurons. And my background, I'm from Manitoba. I did my undergrad at the Université de Saint-Boniface, so that's a francophone university for the first 2 years of my undergrad, and then the last 2 years at the University of Manitoba for my undergrad, and then my master's at U of M, and then Western at the University of Western Ontario, and then I did postdocs at McGill, and I was eventually hired at McGill. So it's been a very interesting road, long road. Academia usually is a long road, but I'm just so very grateful that I have my own lab now and get to ask questions that I'm most interested in, have my own team of students.
Mm-hmm. And what have been some of the current research projects that you've been working on?
Yeah, so I have a student who is working currently on neurogenesis in migrating songbirds, so European starlings. So we're looking how neurogenesis changes with age in these birds, and also how that potentially relates to migration distance of their parents. Mm-hmm. So that's more the fundamental question that we have. We also have a more applied question. So we're also looking at the effects of chlorpyrifos on neurogenesis. Okay, so chlorpyrifos is an insecticide that is widely used in Canada, and it's been shown actually in children to affect IQ. So we're looking more from the bird side of things, but I think it's important to look at birds, right? Because birds are declining at rapid rates, and we can use birds as well as models for answering questions about what could potentially happen with us. Obviously, it's not like a medical study. We're not working with rodents, but birds have very high levels of neurogenesis and are potentially quite sensitive to chemicals. And in many ways, although they're quite phylogenetically far away from us, they're not mammals like us, what we see in their brain could also happen in our brain as well. So there are definitely many similarities between the mammalian brain and the avian brain.
Mm-hmm. And so far, at least with your research revolving around studying the brain and birds, have you found fairly interesting discoveries as a result of that? Or are there any sorts of insights that you've gained as to maybe this could be applied to the human brain as well?
So right now, my lab is quite new, right? I just started in 2019, so I don't have any students who have graduated. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the interesting findings were during my PhD and postdoc. And actually, yes, we did find some very interesting findings during my PhD. So we worked with obligate brood parasites, and this is another part of my research program currently. So obligate brood parasites are birds that rely solely on other species to raise their young. 1% of all bird species are obligate brood parasites. So, and there are 10,000 species of birds in the world approximately. So about 100 are obligate brood parasites. So it's a rare reproduction strategy. But it's a very powerful model because in the system, in some brood parasites, only the females search for host nests, and whereas males follow them. And we actually found in obligate brood, especially in brown-headed cowbirds. So this is the obligate brood parasite that we see in Canada. Its native range is the prairies, so Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and in the states, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wyoming, all those areas. Now they've expanded their range due to habitat fragmentation. But in this species, again, it's only the female that searches for host nests, and they parasitize over 200 different host species. So they're host generalists. And what we found is at the level of cognition and the brain, we see a female bias sex difference. So what I mean by that is when we test these birds on ecologically relevant tasks, so a task that resembles what they do in the wild, we see that females outperform males, which is quite neat. Usually in the literature, if there's a sex difference, it's usually male bias, and that's more in the when it comes to mammals, polygynous mammals like voles, right, like rodents. So that's on the cognition side of things, but also with neurogenesis, we actually found that female cowbirds have higher levels of neurogenesis in their hippocampus. And now the hippocampus is an important part of the brain for spatial memory. We found that it's higher in female cowbirds than male cowbirds, but that there's no sex difference in a non-parasitic relative. So the red-winged blackbird, also a species that we find in Canada, that's closely related to the brown-headed cowbird, but is not an obligate brood parasite. So it's quite interesting because in terms of behavior, we see a reversal of sex-typical space use when it comes to addressing sex differences. And cognition follows that, and also what happens at the level of the brain. And also, yes, from a medical standpoint, this is something a lab's not doing yet, but I would like to do it in the future, is that neurogenesis in the bird brain and the adult bird brain is quite high, higher than mammals. So in humans, for disorders like dementia-related disorders like Alzheimer's disease, is actually we see a sharp drop in neurogenesis in the hippocampus, actually, in people who are diagnosed with these diseases. So if we can find a way that birds regulate neurogenesis or understand better the mechanism behind neurogenesis and why it's so much higher in birds than in mammals, then this could be a key to unlocking a cure for Alzheimer's disease. And again, that's not the primary focus of my lab. My lab does study our focus is ecology and how ecology shapes the brain and behavior, cognition. But this is still a link to medicine, and some of our findings could guide medical research. So so I would say there's fundamental questions that we're interested in, but also questions that could be related to that are related to medicine, but also ecotoxicology. So we also study how contaminants in our environment affect the brain. So definitely our research is multifaceted.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's super interesting. I didn't know that there were so many different sort of implications that could come out of that research. Do you know, like, with regards to the birds that you were studying, whether there were certain like environmental factors, etc., that sort of shape this different dynamic between the sexes?
Mm-hmm. So that's a good follow-up question. Yeah, so it's similar to what I was mentioning in terms of their behavior. So specifically, it's host nest searching. Mm-hmm. So the females are searching for host nests, and in the wild, they can't parasitize at any time. They have to remember the stage of the host nest, where it is, and how many eggs there are in the nest. There are many hosts, but some hosts are more suitable hosts than others, and there's evidence that suggests that female cows can actually distinguish between better hosts and worse hosts. So there's a lot of information that females need to remember, And they have to link that to spatial memory, right? They have to be able to return to this nest when it's the right time to parasitize. In addition, cowbirds lay up to 50 eggs per season.
Oh, wow.
So that's huge. You know, if you look at a songbird, yeah, they may have a clutch of 4 to 6 eggs, and they may have 2, maybe 3 clutches in a season. But cowbirds can lay 50 eggs, and then this is a maximum, it's not an average, but up to 50 eggs. So 1 egg every 24 hours, up to 50. So every day they need to have a plan for the future, right? They need to search through the forest, the edges of the forest, and find host nests, remember the stage of the host nest. So if the nest is complete, you know, if they parasitize the nest when it's not complete, then the host will just continue finishing the nest, and their egg will be buried in the nest lining and it won't hatch. So to ensure that the probability of their egg hatching is maximized, they have to remember the location, they have to remember the timing of the stage of the nest cycle, potentially the host species as well. They do, you know, it's not adapted for them to lay eggs in, you know, a hawk's nest, but there are records of this. Sometimes cowbirds just don't have a plan for the next morning, and they have to lay their eggs somewhere, and sometimes they do lay eggs in inappropriate host nests. So that's a highly complex information, and the environment is highly complex as well. So when they search for host nests, it's actually during the day, usually late morning. But when they parasitize host nests, it's actually before sunrise, when it's dark. And when I was doing my master's at Delta Marsh Field Station in Manitoba, so that's on the south shore of Lake Manitoba, there is a wonderful, this is a very, very special site. So there's a riparian forest, so a forest just along the water. That's very narrow. That's between Lake Manitoba and Delta Marsh. And my assistants and I, we would find up to on average, we would find about 500 yellow warbler nests per breeding season. So many nests, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then we would go and we would be like cowbirds, right? We would do these clutch manipulation studies, and this is more on the host perspective. So that's what I studied for my master's and undergraduate research, was looking how the hosts respond to being parasitized. So we would encounter cowbirds sometimes, obviously, right? Because that's within the cowbird's native range, and there are many, many cowbirds in the prairies. And we would find parasitized nests. But sometimes before sunrise, we would be walking in the forest, it's pitch black, and we would see cowbirds at the nest. And it's quite amazing. They go directly to the nest. It's not like they're searching at that point. They have an accurate spatial map of where the nests are. And they're relying almost entirely on spatial memory and maybe using some visual cues. But it's a very difficult environment, especially before sunrise. So we've walked in the forest at that time, and it's really not an easy thing to find nests again. And for them, it seems like it's easy. So yes, to answer your question, it's a highly, highly complex environment for cowbirds, for female cowbirds, and the males in the wild. We've just seen them; they follow them. So the male cowbirds follow the females, but they don't help them find host nests. I just want to add to that. So this is the case with brown-headed cowbirds. It's also the case with shiny cowbirds in South America. Mm-hmm. But species like the screaming cowbird in South America, both males and females help find search. They help, the males help the females search for host nests. And in that species, the size of the hippocampus is similar between the sexes. So I just want to say that it's not in all brood parasites that we see the sex difference. It's only in brood parasites where we see that females only search for host nests.
Well, this definitely seems like a super interesting species. Like you mentioned, like they lay like 50 eggs. They have much better spatial awareness probably than some other birds. What made you decide that you wanted to study these cowbirds specifically as opposed to other species? Was it just you were looking at previous literature and you found it super interesting, or Because personally, like, I'm not sure if you've previously understood sort of more about the cognitive ability of these birds, but it seems to me that they're quite different from a bunch of other species.
They are, that's right. They are quite different. Yeah, they're rare, right? Like just 1% of all bird species are brood parasites. I was interested in learning more about cowbird cognition when I was doing my master's research. So I was working with yellow warblers. So yellow warblers will actually bury cowbird eggs as an anti-parasite strategy. So it's really interesting by how hosts deal with being parasitized. And it's thinking about hosts that made me think about cowbirds. I was like, oh my, this is a super complex environment. There are many nests. You have to keep track of all these nests. There's competition between female cowbirds. So I was thinking, holy smokes, this is a lot of information for one bird to remember, for one individual to remember. So I searched the literature. So I found that my PhD supervisor, my former PhD supervisor, David Sherry at the University of Western Ontario, he specifically works at the Advanced Facility for Avian Research, which is an absolutely phenomenal facility, really world-class facility that focuses on the study of birds. David Sherry, who is actually quite well known for discovering that food-storing birds have a larger hippocampus than non-food storing birds. So he actually found that the hippocampus is related to spatial memory in birds, and it's larger in food storing birds. So birds that cache food, that hide food, they have a very large hippocampus when you compare them to non-food storing birds. So that's his main system. But he also published this paper in Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, so a very prestigious journal, where he found that female cowbirds have a larger hippocampus than male cowbirds. That was just looking at volume. So that was in the early 90s that he found that. So I was interested while I was doing my master's research, and I thought it would be interesting to study cognition in cowbirds. And then I searched online to see if there was somebody that actually studies cowbird cognition, who has studied cowbird cognition, that could help mentor me. And I found David Sherry, and he was within Canada, so it was great. I was open to going to the United States for my PhD. I definitely was, but I prefer to stay in Canada just because the system is a bit different here. Although it's changing, at the time that I was doing my master's, it was expected for people to do a master's, and then your PhD was shorter. So because I did a master's and published a lot for my master's, then I was able to do a PhD that just took it's still a long time, but took 4 years. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the States, PhDs, people usually go directly from undergrad to PhD, and PhDs can take much longer. Like, I don't know what the average is, but it's definitely longer than 4 years. I've heard it's not uncommon for PhDs to take 7 years or 8 years in the US. So I wanted to do a Canadian PhD for that reason. And also it happened to be perfect that the mentor that it was quite in line with my interests happened to be in Canada. So that's how I found my PhD lab. Mm-hmm. And it's also just from a broader neuroecology standpoint, it's powerful to have a system that has the reversal of sex typical space use, right? Because if we've looked at other researchers have looked at mammals for many years, and to really determine if it's evolution and ecology that's influencing the brain, and not just sex itself, because potentially maybe testosterone is playing a role, right? So if we just study sex differences in one direction, we can't conclude strongly and with confidence that it's the actual differences in the ecology of those sexes. We have to have a reversal, a system in which we see the reverse, and mm-hmm. that's the brood parasite system.
I see. Yeah, well, I mean, also based off of my understanding, you've had to work with live birds as well for many of your studies. So I thought it'd be interesting if you could discuss a bit about like what the process is like to conduct research on live animals, because I don't know too much about how that works out.
Yeah, it's an important question. It's an interesting and important question. So it really depends on what type of work you do with the animals, right? So for my master's research, I was working with free-ranging, so wild yellow warblers, which are protected under the Migratory Bird Act. So it's illegal for anybody without a permit to go to a bird nest and disturb it. So you definitely need a lot of permits for that. So we were doing clutch manipulation studies. We were changing the size of the egg just to see how and the shape of the egg, just to see how that would influence the yellow warbler's response to parasitism. For that work, we needed a Canadian Wildlife Service permit to monitor nests and to manipulate the clutches. And in addition to that, we needed permission from our animal care committee. So each university has an animal care committee that meets, usually it's every month, and they look over applications, and the committee consists of animal care technicians, vets, other professors, and they look through your application, and it can be a long process. Usually there are revisions. They ask you to justify what you're doing, and then you have to send back your answers. And sometimes they don't allow you to do what you're requesting. So it's definitely a process that ensures that animals do not suffer, or if there's any type of pain, it's minimized. So so for field work, it's definitely more than lab work, in the sense that you're working with birds that are protected under the Migratory Bird Act. But also my lab, and I have animal holding facilities now at McGill. So eventually we'd like to bring in cowbirds and do cognitive tests with cowbirds. And so I would need permission, again, animal care permission. And with cowbirds, it's a bit different. So cowbirds and red-winged blackbirds, they're actually considered agricultural pests in Canada. So they're not as, the protection status isn't as strong as with yellow warblers. So we wouldn't need the same level of permitting as with yellow warblers. But I have to check, so that's the other thing too. I don't have birds in captivity yet in Quebec, so I'd have to make sure that there could be some Quebec requirements. There probably are Quebec permits as well that I have to look into. So there's that. And when you're doing field work, you have to make sure that you have permission to do work on the land that you're working. It's that's highly important, right? The community has to be aware. If you're working on their land, or if you're working on private property, it's important you talk to people, you introduce yourself, and be honest about what you're doing. And some people may not be okay with manipulating bird nests or collecting cowbirds to do neuroscience work. So it's important that people are on board, and if they're not, then you have to find other locations to do your work. So there's definitely quite a bit of prep for actually doing the work. In fact, it can take months to get permission to do what we're doing.
I see. Yeah, well, I mean, also though, like when you're actually conducting the field work, have you found that, especially because you're dealing with like wild species, like does that affect your research?
Yes, absolutely. That's the nature of field work, right? It's not like lab work. So yes, that has happened where we had experiments in the wild, and there was a day that I poured, and we were supposed to do an experiment on that day. So we would lose all those nests, not like lose them for our experiment. Obviously, the birds were fine, but I remember in my master's, we had a big day to do an experiment, and we were to increase our sample size by 36, and I had a large team of students, and there was lightning all day long, and it wasn't safe for them to go out. I didn't feel it was safe for them to go out and do that research. So I made a call, and for me, the safety of my team is more important than the research. Although the research is highly important, obviously I don't want to put anybody in danger. So we had to forego that day of testing. We lost 30 sample set of 36. And I had to make up for that. Yeah, it was it was so disappointing. But we were able to find more nests. So what we had to do is find more nests to make up for those. So it's important in field work to be flexible and to be ready, and to always be on your feet, be on your toes, to understand, okay, if this doesn't work, we're gonna have to try this. And more recently, I had a student in the field who was collecting cowbirds and red-winged blackbirds, and he wasn't able to collect the sample size that he needed. So we've learned from the field, and we're gonna modify a few things in future years, and then we have to just go back on potentially maybe this fall, or probably not this fall, the fall after, to redo the experiment. So yes, fieldwork is definitely quite time consuming, especially if you're relying on breeding seasons. Because if things don't work when breeding season, you have to wait an entire other year. So that's quite a challenge if you're a master's student, right? Because a master's is, on average takes 2 to 3 years. So if a student loses an entire field season, then I work with them and we say, okay, how can we modify your project so that you're able to finish on time, right? We do that, or I go in the field with my students. I don't necessarily I don't spend the entire field season with them normally, because I have several students and I have to make sure that I separate my time and my attention, evenly between all students. But what's important is that I go in the field, I train them, I provide them with hands-on training until they're comfortable, and then I return to the lab. And then when students are being trained in the lab, I train them in the lab until they're comfortable. And sometimes I pair them with other experienced students. So there's definitely a lot of training involved. Mm-hmm. And when it comes specifically to field, when it comes to field work, just being ready to change the project if necessary.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that process definitely seems difficult, but you have been really successful so far. So I think that's really great. Even though it's a long process, it's probably really rewarding. But yeah, I guess just like jumping into like our last major question, this is like more so looking at like ecology as a whole, like from this like overarching perspective. What influence do you think this field has on our environment and society as a whole? Like, what are the reasons why ecology is so important?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Sometimes people ask me, they're shocked that I'm funded by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. So I'm funded by the federal government. Mm-hmm. And they ask, well, taxpayers are paying for this research. Why is this important? It's not always obvious to us. Well, obviously the obvious component of my research is the ecotoxicology side of things, right? Because we're using birds as models as sentinels, essentially, for environmental contamination, which affects both humans and wildlife. And some of my research has been used in policy decisions. So definitely there's a strong connection, and strong and obvious connection between my research and how that benefits society. But from ecology, yes, so from specifically just ecology, from purely the fundamental side of my research, sometimes it's not as clear and obvious to people. And what I say is that, first of all, the pursuit of knowledge has been a strong factor in these serendipitous discoveries in the past. Like, for example, penicillin was just a fundamental research project that there's a serendipitous discovery there. So a lot of these fundamental research projects usually and frequently lead to these discoveries that are more applicable to society and to humans. But even putting that aside, learning more about our natural world is, I find, critical, especially during these times. Birds have been declining at a rapid rate. We've lost billions and billions of birds. And birds play an important role in our ecosystem. They get rid of pests. They pollinate. They get rid of carcasses on the side of the road, right? Like vultures. Mm-hmm. They play so many ecological roles in our environment that if we lose them, it'll be a huge, it would be an environmental disaster. So just learning more about birds and how ecology influences how they behave, how that influences their brain, that is critical. And I would also say that learning more about our natural world gives us more respect for it, right? I think a lot of people don't know about, I tell people about cowbirds and how they behave and how females have to think, right? They have to think and they have to remember, they have to recall that information. then there's this curiosity that builds, and then people have this newfound respect for birds in their environment. And also now when they see birds, it's no longer just any brown bird. They're able to identify birds and ask questions about them. And just by doing that, I think that is highly beneficial to our society. Who respect our natural world will be better equipped to protect it and be more motivated to protect it.
For sure. Well, I think that's a great way to end off. Before we finish, though, if our listeners have any sorts of questions or comments that they would like to make, or if they just want to get in contact with you, what would be the best way for them to connect with you online?
Yeah, so they can visit my new website. I just revised it a couple weeks ago. So www.guiguenolab.ca, and my last name is spelled Guiguen, as in Nancy, O. So www.guiguenolab.ca. You can visit my website, read about research projects going on in my lab under the Lab Members tab, read more about media and news in my lab. And there's also my email address on the last tab, so melanie.guigueno@mcgill.ca. So feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. I'd be happy to connect with you and tell you more about our research.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to do this call with me. Really appreciate it, and I've definitely learned a lot from this conversation.
I'm glad to hear. And yeah, thank you for your interest and for reaching out.